Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. Dramatic news this week in the Middle East, and it's not Gaza, it's not Lebanon, it's not Iran. If you had Syria on your bingo card, then you're the big winner and smarter than everyone else, since few people saw this coming. The fall of the Assad regime in less than 2 weeks, after over 5 terrible decades in power. To get a sense of how these historic events look from Israel, we have back with us my dear friend Yaakov Lappin. Yaakov is a military and strategic affairs analyst, a researcher at both the Miriam Institute and the Alma Center, and he was previously the longtime military correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. This was a great conversation on how recent events in Syria look from Israel, both the peril and the opportunity, as well as how and why Israel took preemptive action on the ground and from the air in recent days all across Syria. At the end, we also zoomed out and asked the big question, has Israel won the war? Let's get to Yaakov Lappin. Hi, Yaakov. Welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be here, Neri. It's been a while.
It has been a while. I checked, and it was February when you were on last. I was telling someone last night that you were on in the summer, but obviously time has no meaning anymore. So it's almost been a year since you were last on. A lot has changed since February, which is the reason why I wanted to have you back on today. Historic days once more in the Middle East, as they have been now for well over a year. I wanted to focus mostly on Syria today and the demise of the Assad regime and how Israel is closely watching events across the border and already acting aggressively across the border. And we'll get into all that in a minute. But I want to start here, Yaakov, giving our listeners a bit of perspective, a little bit of context. This regime in Damascus had been, past tense, had been in power for over 50 years. Obviously an enemy state to Israel, but direct conflict and clashes between Israel and Syria had been pretty rare since the 1980s, I dare say. And the Golan Heights, up until the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011, had been fairly quiet, all things considered. And yet, there weren't a lot of tears shed over here in Israel that Bashar al-Assad and this Ba'athist regime were deposed, despite the fact that obviously Sunni jihadist rebels with past ties to al-Qaeda were the ones that did the deposing and are now running things in Damascus. So let's start here. Why indeed was Syria under the Assads viewed as a real security problem for Israel?
Well, because it was the central pillar in the Iranian strategy that's often referred to as the Ring of Fire, or Iran's hegemonic plans not only to take over the Middle East, but also to set up a network of proxies that included Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah, the flagship proxy in Lebanon, and tens of thousands of Shiite militia members in Syria, as well as Hezbollah in Syria, and using Syria in many ways to act as a central pillar for the whole Iranian proxy Shiite crescent, it's often referred to, strategy. And basically what Iran was doing in Syria was, A, using it as a weapons transit zone. So much of the arms, the stockpiles, the rockets, the advanced weaponry was moving through Syria, whether it was by ground convoys from Iraq that originated in arms factories in Iran. And then when those started getting bombed on a very regular basis, the Iranians switched, they pivoted, and they started building and co-opting weapons factories on Syrian soil.
For Hezbollah in Lebanon.
For Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also to set up missile launch sites in Syria itself. Everything that the Iranians did in Syria had a sort of double significance. It was to help Hezbollah in Lebanon and basically allow Iran to touch the Mediterranean Sea to reach Lebanon and to bolster the war front that it was building there. And at the same time, to turn Syria into an adjacent war front against Israel. So capabilities were going to Lebanon and they were being entrenched in Syria itself. And we actually saw a lot of activities that were sort of based on the success of the Iranian project in Lebanon, the former success, I should say, in terms of also building a civilian infrastructure. There was a sort of whole process of bringing in Shiite families, family members of these Shiite militiamen, settling them in Damascus, ethnically cleansing the Sunnis from whole areas of Syria, and trying to change the demographic balance in Iran's favor, setting up cultural and religious and Shiite centers. So really, Iran was about turning Syria into an extension of the southern Lebanese model. And therefore, it was a severe threat. And the Assad regime was, for most of this time, very much dependent on Iran because Iran helped save it from the first phase of the civil war, this decade-long brutal civil war. So the regime was, basically couldn't say no to the Iranians, didn't have the ability to say no. And so what's happened here is a collapse of a huge plank of the Iranian strategy, the Iranian regional strategy, both against Israel and regarding the wider Sunni Arab world. And this is a major blow to Iran, and this is why many in Israel view the collapse of the Assad regime as a positive thing, as a net gain for Israeli security.
That's a good sum up. And we should also mention it's not just the Iranians who came to Assad's aid during the civil war and really stemmed the tide initially. It was also the Russians.
100%.
It's a reversal also for Russian influence, Russian designs in the Middle East, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was definitely part of the reason why the Assad regime folded so quickly. I don't think anyone, even a week ago, truly predicted, could have believed that Assad's army didn't really fight, didn't really put up a fight, and that the Iranians and its Shiite proxies and militias, as well as the Russians, didn't really come to Bashar al-Assad's aid. Were you surprised by that? And were you surprised that the Syrian Arab Army folded like a house of cards in less than 2 weeks?
So regarding the Russian aspect, I think it is very important to point out, as you did, that this has global ramifications because the Middle Eastern Iranian axis that has suffered a major blow was part of a global axis that included Russia, includes China, includes North Korea, which is facing off against the West. So this is not just a regional story. So this definitely, should be stressed. And regarding the speed in which hundreds of thousands of members of the Syrian Arab Army, the Assad military, collapsed, it's surprising how fast it happened, but it's not surprising that it happened. And the reason I think that it's not really surprising is because all of the assistance mechanisms that Syria's allies, Assad's allies, had in place during the civil war were not in place this time. First and foremost, Hezbollah on the ground was in no position to send, thousands of well-trained, well-equipped terrorist operatives into Syria like it did during the civil war. Hezbollah played a critical role in stabilizing the war fronts in Syria. It also learned how to fight like a real military in Syria during those years. And it couldn't do this now because it had been basically torn apart by the IDF over the past 3 months through a series of massive air campaigns and ground campaigns. And it was in no position to send in those reinforcements. So that was a huge difference. And Russia itself couldn't come in and save its client state, the Assad regime, because it's so bogged down on the Ukrainian front in Eastern Europe. And it just doesn't have the military resources to send more fighter jets than the ones that were based already in Syria, a few squadrons at Khamimim Air Base, etc. So basically, Assad found himself alone. And I think it was primarily a psychological collapse. Once the rebels were able to move out of Idlib and take Aleppo so quickly, take Hama so quickly, there was some kind of psychological breakdown which caused the entire system to the people in the Assad regime system to say this is a lost cause and we better start looking after ourselves. We better abandon our positions, take off our uniforms. Some left the country. Some are trying to blend into, their civilian surroundings. Some probably moved to the Alawite heartland there on the western coast. And they really started talking and thinking about personal survival. And as soon as they got into that state of mind, it was over. It was basically over. And absolutely, I think that this is a domino effect from the dramatic blows that Hezbollah absorbed in Lebanon. I think that was the thing that put the idea into the minds of the rebels that now was the right time to make their move. The Iranian Shiite axis, which had kept them trapped in northwest Syria, was down, its defenses were down, its ability to mobilize forces were down, and they saw their opportunity. So I view it as a direct knock-on effect from what happened in Lebanon. We haven't talked about the Turkish role. I'm sure we will. But these are, I think, the biggest regional and international dynamics that led to this incredible, I call it a once-in-a-century earthquake. To see a regime fall, as you say, like a house of cards in 11 days is something that we have not seen in this neighborhood ever. I don't remember anything like this.
Yeah, well, as someone mentioned to me a few days ago, who is older than us and has a longer memory, when Hamas took over Gaza back in 2007, it was a bit similar to that. It took over Gaza, obviously from the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah movement, in 6 days. And it really was like a house of cards, like we saw in Syria. Obviously, Gaza much smaller than an entire country like Syria. And I think you're right, Yaakov, that the timing of this rebel offensive out of Idlib in northwestern Syria wasn't a coincidence. That it started, we should remember, exactly 2 weeks ago. We're recording this on Wednesday afternoon, Tel Aviv time. So exactly 2 weeks ago was when the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire began. So they basically chose the exact moment where Hezbollah was at its weakest, when the ceasefire was about to begin, after, like you said, 3 months of Israeli, military work on Hezbollah, coupled with the fact that I think in the rebels' minds, they couldn't know for certain that the incoming president back in the States, Donald Trump, wouldn't actually force the Ukrainians to end the war in Russia. So basically right now, you still have Russia kind of bogged down and tied down in the Ukraine war. So again, I think that was also in the back of their minds as well, that it was the right time, both regionally and internationally, for them to strike. I don't know if anybody really knows whether they thought they'd be able to do this so quickly. I've seen some reports that they basically they were trying to break out of Idlib and take Aleppo, maybe the outlying countryside in kind of northern Syria. But once it went so swimmingly, they just kept moving until they took Damascus on Sunday. The Turkish role in all of this, what do you think? There are some assessments that Turkish President Erdogan was really the one behind the scenes pulling the strings for this rebel offensive.
Right. And I don't think that Erdogan was the initiator or the catalyst for this. But what I do think is that he has been planning for this day. In other words, he has built basically a Turkish proxy system in Syria, in which a number of rebel organizations, primarily ones that are under the framework of the Syrian National Army, which ironically is supposed to be the more nationalist, less Islamist umbrella group. But really, these definitions don't have so much meaning because every one of these umbrella groups has dozens of subgroups, sub-actors in them, and there's a huge variety amongst them. Some of them really are remnants of the Free Syrian Army, and they're nationalist, and they don't have an Islamist agenda, but others are pretty fundamentalist in nature and ideology. And it's those groups that are more in line, I think, with the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, and ones that have possibly Turkmen fighters in them, that are getting the most amount of assistance from Turkey. I think that we're seeing, real logistical supply lines moving out of Turkey towards these groups, bolstering these proxies now that are moving across Syria. And I think Turkey has a couple of plans and agendas when it comes to Syria. First and foremost, they want to push the Kurds, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which has been critical in fighting ISIS all these years and has been a loyal U.S. ally, now finds itself under attack. According to some reports, by the way, I haven't seen them confirmed, there are Turkish forces moving in northern Syria together with the Turkish proxies against the Kurds. And the Kurds are facing attacks from the Turkish Air Force, completely unprovoked attacks against a force that has been intrinsic in fighting ISIS. And I think the Kurds really need help, and I'm not sure they're getting any. So I think that's the primary agenda, is push the SDF away from the Turkish border. Obviously, Turkey wants to see the 4 million or so Syrian refugees that have settled in Turkey go back to their homes, and we've started seeing that massive traffic back into Syria. And I think the third agenda here is to basically extend this sort of neo-Ottoman Islamist vision, this thing that Erdogan has been obsessed with for so many years, this is the first time I think that he really sees an opportunity to expand his neo-Ottoman sphere of influence. And that means supporting groups in Syria. That might mean trying to push those groups to Israel's borders. We have seen some very aggressive rhetoric from Erdogan regarding Israel in recent months. I think his real agenda is pretty clear. He's ideologically, religiously hostile to the state of Israel, and he tries to maneuver, this way and that, but that is a constant. And now he might see an opportunity to show the wider Arab world, the Arab world that has rebuffed him so clearly in recent years, that his vision has a chance now at influencing the new Middle East. So we're going to have to watch that pretty carefully. But the first target, I think, of Turkey's agenda in Syria is the Kurdish forces. They're the ones who are under direct attack. And I think that Israel will be looking at possibilities of how to assist them. We've already heard Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar say yesterday that these attacks are wrong, that they need to stop. So we're seeing already at the rhetorical level, at least, Israel positioning itself as a partner to the Kurds, and we'll have to see how that materializes beyond statements. So there's that, and then obviously the situation in southern Syria. We're going to have to see which of these groups. There are so many different groups. Which one of them moves closest to the border? And because Israel's taking no chances, and we haven't mentioned this yet, so I think we have to.
We're getting into it in just a second.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't you worry.
There's just so much going on. It's incredible.
It really is incredible, and Syria itself is just a tapestry of groups, militias, foreign powers acting inside. Obviously, you have 800 or 900 U.S. military special forces in eastern Syria. We'll get all to that in just a second. And
yep.
I think you're right. The Turks, the Ottomans, are back in the Levant for the first time in, almost 100 years, over 100 years.
Right.
So we'll see how far Erdogan wants to push it as well. So let's get into what's happening now on the ground. And we'll start with Israel, obviously. This past weekend, almost immediately as Damascus was falling on Sunday, the IDF started to do two things. Number one, it sent tanks and infantry into the buffer zone on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. It's called the Area of Separation, this demilitarized zone dating back to the 1974 armistice agreement between Israel and Syria after the Yom Kippur War. IDF troops basically seized abandoned Syrian army positions, including at the very top of the Golan Heights on Mount Hermon, known in Arabic as Jabal al-Sheikh. And number two, and even more dramatically, we saw these waves of airstrikes all across Syria targeting all the important strategic assets that were left of the Syrian Arab Army, basically missiles, planes, helicopters, chemical weapons, tanks, you name it. Most of it was destroyed over the course of 2 days earlier this week. Really remarkable stuff. What did you think of both the ground incursion and the air campaign that Israel launched on Syria, basically, after the fall of Assad?
So what I'm seeing is really the lessons of October 7th being applied very, very firmly. And the key lesson here is about capabilities and not allowing for even the possibility of threatening capabilities to be built up on our borders. And, Israel has spent many years bombing radical Shiite attempts to set up shop in the southern Syrian Golan Heights. And now what it seems to be signaling is that it's not going to allow Sunni fundamentalist forces to do the same. And to that end, it's everything you described. We saw very quick ground action to to take positions all across the buffer zone and what they call the Syrian Mount Hermon, the upper part of Mount Hermon, which is going to basically prevent anybody from moving into those positions, because once the Syrian Arab Army abandoned those positions, there was nobody to stop the other forces operating in Syria from moving in. And so Israel said, if that's the situation, it's going to be us there until we understand what's going on. And this can take a very long time to figure that out. It might be a matter of years. So the ground activity was very firm, but the aerial and naval strikes, I think, are even more dramatic. What we're seeing here is the destruction of a state military, both its conventional and unconventional capabilities. It took decades to build this with Iranian and Russian assistance, decades of force buildup went up in smoke in a matter of almost 48 hours. I've never seen anything like it in geopolitical military history. We're talking about, air bases, squadrons, armored bases, missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles.
Air defenses.
The IDF sent a list last night, but we're talking about 350 aerial strikes by fighter jets, and I'm sure that drones were involved. Talking about Navy ships striking the Syrian Navy, the Assad Navy sites in Latakia. The entire Assad military, with some remnants, has survived this attack, but almost the whole of the Assad military is off the map. So when you couple that with the collapse of the regime, this is truly historic in my mind. We're living through history, and Israel clearly made the decision that it is not going to wait around and to try to track and find out who is going to take over which capability. Just think about the intelligence effort that would be involved here. We've got dozens of Syrian rebel groups, each with their own ideology and agenda and backer. And now, instead of saying, okay, this group is moving towards this base, should we let them, take over the base? They eliminated the dilemma. It's all been taken off. All the capabilities have been taken off the table. And now it's sort of starting from scratch. So this was, in my mind, the application of October 7th lessons, which is do not allow threatening capabilities to be built up on our borders, or in this case, for strategic capabilities to fall into hands, the intentions of which are not clear. Nobody really knows, what the long-term intentions are of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the most powerful rebel alliance. Nobody really knows whether the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Muhammad al-Julani, whether he's fighting a religious war or whether he just wants to liberate Syria from the Assad regime. And instead of waiting around to find out, Israel said these capabilities are off the table, and now we've reset the situation, and anybody who wants to get along with Israel is welcome to do so. We'll find a state that reciprocates peaceful coexistence, and anybody who comes to our border with hostile intentions will be met with preemptive military strikes. So it's historic. It's absolutely historic, and I view this as a direct extension of the lessons and the trauma from October 7th.
It's a good point. It's a post-October 7th world, a post-October 7th reality. And also Israel was able to do this, right? That the Russians also fled, at least to the coast, and we'll see how long the Russian military assets remain on the Syrian coast. The Iranians also, for the most part, left. And yes, I suppose Israel didn't want to wait and see if HTS or anyone else was able to co-opt a Syrian Air Force squadron to its ranks, or surface-to-surface missiles, long-range rockets, and the like, to say nothing of chemical weapons, remnants of chemical weapons.
Right.
So, like you said, dramatic moves, and the incursion into the buffer zone also dramatic. I've been getting a lot of questions, not least from my bosses. How long will Israel actually stay in this buffer zone? What do you think? Because you know as well as I do that basically the Golan Heights is kind of this higher ground that Israel has held, obviously, since 1967, and that the DMZ, this buffer zone, is kind of in the valley that the Golan Heights looks down on. So
right.
Is Israel really going to keep, I don't know, platoons, battalions in this kind of valley indefinitely?
Pretty much, I think. Let's put it this way. This is, of course, just my own personal assessment, right? But when that disengagement agreement was reached in 1974 with Syria, and it was done so under the auspices of the United Nations, and then they sent in the UNDOF force, the observer force, peacekeepers.
Who are still there, by the way.
Who are still there, and by the way, came under an attack by rebel forces, and it was the IDF that actually saved that position, directly intervened. And not for the first time, by the way. That also happened during the Syrian civil war.
Correct.
So look, this was an arrangement that was in place between two states. To put it in the most simple way possible, this was an arrangement between two sovereign states, two recognized UN members, and it made sense. There was a war. There was a need now to separate the forces. There was a logical arrangement on how to do that. And it was a perfectly functional setup. Now, the thing began to unravel long before this current junction. It began to unravel when Syria stopped being a real state. And that happened at the beginning of the civil war. We're going back to 2012, when various rebel groups, Sunnis and Shiites, began setting up a presence in the Golan Heights. But that wasn't enough of a reason for Israel to move into the buffer zone, because the Syrian army was still there. It lost control, it came back, and Israel was able to sort of, through targeted operation strikes, and it also, at some point, had communications with the Sunni rebels who took over the southern Golan Heights during the first phase of the civil war. So it found a way to manage that because the Syrian state hadn't fully collapsed. And then the Syrian Assad state came back and took control. Now we have a completely different situation. There is no Syrian state in existence right now. That's the de facto reality. And so all of the people who are saying, well, wait a second, this is an infringement of sovereignty, really they're using terminology which is just not representative of reality. Nobody can point to a Syrian state right now except one that exists, online or on an atlas. There are dozens of groups that are running around Syria, and nobody knows what the power structure will look like. If and when Syria becomes a state again, then I think Israel will examine the nature of that state, the ideology of that state, the way that state views Israel. And if it's found to be a moderate and peaceful neighbor, then yes, I think that Israel would, under that scenario, pull its troops back to the Alpha line, to the Israeli side of the buffer zone. But that seems to be a very far off scenario right now. We have no idea how Syria is going to play out. So until, Syria becomes an actual functional state, which is, able to recognize previous international commitments, until that happens, I don't see those Israeli forces going anywhere.
That's, I think, a reasonable assessment. And like you said, and we'll get into it in a second, the intentions and the makeup of this new Syrian government, I suppose, or regime. But before we get to that, we'll be right back after this brief message.
During this period of upheaval in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, Israeli politics, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional affairs, Israel Policy Forum experts are shedding light on complex policy issues and breaking news developments impacting Israel's future as secure, Jewish, and democratic. Be sure to visit our website, subscribe to our emails, and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky for timely explainers and analysis on key policy issues. Links to these platforms can be found in the show notes of this podcast. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible, nuanced analysis, please make a gift today so that our work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
It is good to think back to the Syrian civil war last decade. Israel was actually operating what they called a good neighbor policy into the Syrian Golan Heights and other parts of southern Syria, especially with the Druze community, but not only, providing food, aid, even a field hospital, by the way, across the border fence, not technically Syrian territory, it was still Israel, but across the border fence. I went up there to visit this hospital in 2017. And you have some voices here in Israel saying that policy should actually be reinstituted, that you need to put your best foot forward and reach out, at least locally, to the various communities. As someone once said, who do you reach out to, right? Who do you reach out to inside Syria? Maybe you'll make friends, but at the very least, you won't make enemies that way. And I'm actually very curious to see if Israel does reinstitute that policy. I think it would be all for the good to show a positive intention vis-a-vis this new Syria. With regard to what's happening in Damascus, inside Syria writ large, you and I have talked about it offline. We also mentioned the various militias, rebel groups, various foreign powers operating as we speak all across Syria, the Turks and the Kurds in the north, in the northeast, the U.S. also in eastern Syria. Again, nobody knows for sure, but is your sense that fragmentation and possibly, I guess, renewed civil war is the most likely outcome? Are we looking at some kind of federalism? Are we looking at some kind of central government, central authority under, I suppose, HTS that's maybe, if not liberal, then democratic. Obviously, HTS and Jolani have been making all the right noises in recent days, but again, it's early days, so they would say all of that. Or are we looking at perhaps a future Syria where you have a strong central authority, but it's obviously extreme, radical, I like to call it maybe the Islamic Republic of Syria. So
right,
kind of a redux of what we saw in Iran after 1979, but obviously Sunni. What do you think is the most likely outcome?
So, I think in the short term, and speaking of Operation Good Neighbor, by the way, I was interviewing a couple of days ago a Lieutenant Colonel in Reserves, Marco Moreno, who was the former senior IDF officer who set up Operation Good Neighbor.
An Israeli named Marco Moreno?
Correct.
He almost sounds like a UN peacekeeper.
He's a veteran member of Unit 504, which is the Human Intelligence Unit, and he actually founded Operation Good Neighbor, ran it from 2012 to 2016. He's often on Khan Channel 11 these days in the evenings talking about Syria, and that's where I got the idea to reach out to him. He seemed to indicate that at least in the short term, his assessment is that it's going to be chaotic in the short term. And he didn't, by the way, say that that was necessarily such a bad thing for Israel. He was saying that Israel, if it knew how to exploit that chaos, it could. He was speaking before the full collapse here, but before that this was another opportunity to harm the Iranian Shiite axis. But I think that this overall assessment that it's going to be chaotic in the short term is accurate, because there are so many moving parts in Syria, and we haven't even covered all of them, and we've been talking for a while. We got the Kurds, we've got what's going to happen with the Alawites. How are the rebels going to create a transitional government that's not just symbolic, but actually starts to rule? What will be the role of Sunni Islam? So many unanswered questions. How will the legal system function when it comes to prosecuting members of the Assad regime who absolutely took part in crimes against humanity? There's no question about that. But will they be able to stick, to a legal process, or are they going to go on a vengeance campaign, a vendetta against the Alawites in general, who ruled over Syria? 3 million or so people, or a little bit, that's approximately their number, ruling over tens of millions of people who did not want to be ruled over by them. So these various sects are now going to have to relearn everything. We got the Christians, we've got the Druze. We haven't talked about the Druze. What's going to happen with them? They're a very important part of the Syrian landscape, and I think they'll be looking to Israel for some protection, particularly because the Israeli Druze community, which is extremely important for the for Israel's society and its defense establishment, will be demanding that the state of Israel does what it can for the Druze of Syria if they need assistance. So I think the first part is going to be chaotic, because there are simply so many moving parts, so many actors, and so many unknowns and opportunities for power struggle. After the short term, then I think we will know, we'll start to see where this is going. If we start to see a settling down of the Syrian system, and we see the various groups buying into the system that's being, formed, then, we can take a more optimistic view and see that Syria will stabilize and perhaps find a way to create a system that enables all of the various Syrian sects to take part. And it's not going to be a Western democracy. That much I can say with confidence today. It's not going to be a liberal democracy. Whatever happens in Syria, I don't think that's where it's going. But it could be a Middle Eastern state with some democratic representation, at least in terms of votes, and perhaps a soft Islamic sort of constitution. That's kind of the best case scenario that I could envisage for the medium-term future, that allows, for Syrian minorities to exist without harassment and oppression. And of course, there are other scenarios which you've alluded to, one of a more hardline Sunni Islamist state with an agenda and an ideology that does not stop at Syria's borders. And if that ends up being the case, that's, of course, going to be a problem, not just for Israel, but also for Jordan, which is certainly no friend of Islamists. It's going to be a problem for regional stability. And then how does that sort of Sunni bloc, which I assume would be allied to Turkey if that occurs, the Sunni Islamist Syria, how would that interact with Iran? That could also be there could be multiple clashes here. So I think it really much depends on, the ideology that takes hold in the new ruling elite and the ability of this elite to extend a political system across the whole of Syria. And, we should remember that Syria hasn't really healed from the civil war prior to this. It remained highly fragmented. Assad never regained 100% control of his territory. He didn't have Idlib, as we know. He didn't have the Kurdish area. And, there were whole areas that never returned to Assad's control. So
right.
If I had to guess, I would say that the short term will be chaotic, and the medium term, I have my doubts about the ability of Hayat al-Tahrir and its various other, rebel allied groups to set up a coherent and peaceful state, let's say in the coming 2 to 3 years. Beyond that, I think it's actually impossible to guess. But I think that they will try. I think they will definitely try, and they will try to convince the international community. I think that they're not after an Islamist international agenda, that they're not fundamentalist, that they've reformed, and they'll be judged by their actions. I think they'll be judged by their actions, and there are many, many scenarios that are possible. I think we should keep an open mind. I'm not going to immediately dismiss the idea that Syria could become a more peaceful and moderate place. I'm not dismissing it. But I think we need to be realistic and look at all the actors here that are involved and understand that there are at least going to be some very significant power struggles in the coming years in Syria.
I think that's a sober-minded assessment. Look, I think, speaking personally, I'd love it if Syria became a functioning state. I don't want to say kind of a liberal democracy, but something approximating a functioning state and not a dictatorship, shall we say. I think the Syrian people very much deserve that after the past 13 years of civil war and the past 5 decades of Assad. And obviously we've all seen the reports and the videos of Assad's dungeons. Again, on a personal note, I'd love it if the Syrian people were able to reclaim their agency, reclaim their freedom, and rebuild something more positive across the border. Having said all that, the recent history of the Middle East doesn't give us a lot of hope, right? Look at the post-Arab Spring in Libya. The Libyans got rid of Gaddafi, and there's still a civil war raging over there. In Iraq, after the fall of Saddam, to a lesser extent, maybe Tunisia, and so on and so forth. So hopefully the new elites, as you put it, in Damascus learn from all those precedents. And then I think as well as I do, anyone who's taken a course back in college in modern Middle East history knows that before the Assads, Hafiz al-Assad, the father, kind of took power in Damascus and ruled with an iron fist, Syria was known for kind of instability. Coup after coup after coup. It was the basket case of the Middle East, and that's saying a lot given, Middle Eastern politics. So we can only hope for the best. I don't think anyone knows quite what will happen. And like I said earlier, Jolani and the HTS are at least making all the right noises, amnesty for Syrian army conscripts, assuaging the fears of the minorities, whether Christian or even Alawite on the coast, trying to reach out to the international community. We know journalists, and some of my colleagues, international journalists, have already gone in, and that's, I think, a positive sign that there is some modicum of outreach to the outside world. But we'll have to wait and see what happens. And obviously Israel, like you said, is closely watching developments. Yaakov, final question, final topic for us to discuss, and it's related to Syria, but bigger picture about what's been happening here in recent months. Obviously the fall of the Assad regime and really the demise of Iranian equities in Syria. This week, 2 weeks ago, the ceasefire in Lebanon, which came after the decimation of Hezbollah, and you alluded to it, and we had Asaf Orion here last week expounding on what exactly happened to Hezbollah. Obviously, we still have ongoing operations in Gaza, but it's more, shall we say, a counterinsurgency than full-blown war against Hamas. And as you and I both know, there are no sirens are really going off across Israel, which was the case for, the better part of 14 months. What do you think? I have been telling people, even before Syria, but now especially after Syria, that Israel has already won the war. So after 14 months, Israel has won the war. The war isn't over, but Israel has won it. What do you think about the current state of affairs of the various multi-front conflicts that are still ongoing, but maybe at a lesser flame than even a few weeks ago?
I agree with your assessment. I think Israel has largely won this war. If I look at the strategy that was in place against Israel, I always sort of saw three components to it. And one was the proxy strategy of Iran. That's Hamas, that's Hezbollah, and the Houthis. But really the two main pillars here were Hamas and Hezbollah. And those two main arms or tentacles, we have so many different analogies in place, they have largely been neutralized. And what that means is that Iran's proxy strategy against Israel has largely been neutralized. That to me is a very dramatic development. And that is a real change in the strategic situation of the Middle East in Israel's favor and to Iran's detriment. The other component of the Iranian strategy is the missile program. And here too, I think that the Iranian missile program has suffered a very serious blow, both because of Israel's defensive capabilities, the Arrow 3, and because Israel was able to strike Iranian production missile sites on Iranian soil. So both defensively and offensively, I think that this threat has lost some of its bite. It's still there. It's absolutely still a threat, but it's not what it was several months ago. And so the last thing that remains, on the threat landscape is the nuclear program. And that, I think this is the one thing that I cannot say right now that there is anything resembling an Israeli victory. In fact, this is the only area where the opposite is happening. The worse things are going for Iran regionally, the more its proxies have been battered and taken out of the picture as relevant regional proxies, the more it seems to be doubling down on its nuclear program and making very alarming progress. So if we include the nuclear program, I think this is the elephant in the room now. But if we look at the general conflict that has been underway between Israel and Iran's allies and proxies and Iran itself, two direct state-on-state exchanges of fire, I agree with what you're saying. I think Israel has come out on top. It took a while. This is obviously the longest war that Israel has fought since 1948. And Israel had to learn so many things on the go, how to fight long wars, how to keep, reserves in action for so long. It paid a terrible price, especially at the start of this war and then throughout this war in casualties. The price and the trauma is going to accompany Israeli society for generations. Mm-hmm. But when you look at it strategically, when you look at it militarily, Israel's position today is almost unrecognizable from where it was a year ago or a little more than a year ago already. We're in a new era, and I think that this is going to have reverberations, not only in Syria, but well beyond in the region. I agree with what you're saying. I think that we're looking at a transformed landscape, really, when we're looking at the threat assessment. And, the best way to illustrate that, to bring it down from the theory, is that, let's say, we're in the Israeli cabinet and we have to think about, will we strike the Iranian nuclear program or not? When we make that decision, we don't have to think about Hamas, and we don't have to think much about Hezbollah either. We don't have to take them into account. What are they going to do? Are they going to flood our skies? Will they launch an invasion from the south and the north? These are not threats that we have to really worry about anymore. And if I had said this sentence to you a year ago, or to anybody, I think it would have been very hard to believe. And yet, this is where we are today. So I think that helps people understand the scope of the change that has occurred here. And it is indeed very, very dramatic in my mind.
Very dramatic. And thinking back to our conversation in February, which was mostly focused on Lebanon and Hezbollah, we were both concerned about full-scale war breaking out between Israel and Hezbollah, given the very real firepower that Hezbollah possessed back then and possessed even a few months ago. And that was just one front in this ring of fire that Iran had tried to build over the course of many years. And now, look, just because Bibi Netanyahu says it doesn't necessarily make it wrong. Brick by brick, as he put it the other day, right, the Shiite axis is being dismantled. Yep. And that is a dramatic development, all for the good, a positive development. And the war that started on October 7th is, like I said, has been won, but it's not over yet. I'm curious to get your sense. Obviously, there's still ongoing operations in Gaza. That's really the most active front right now. Are you still as hardline as you may have been a few months ago in terms of continuing the operations? Do you see a opening, a window, given all the other developments around Israel in recent months, for this government to cut a deal, to get the hostages back, to at least halt, pause, stop the war for X amount of time to get the hostages back?
So look, I think that, when we're talking about the hostages and what a deal might look like, it seems to me that the deal that Hamas is now considering is pretty different from what it was demanding up until, at least until Sinwar was around, and even a little bit after, when his brother Muhammad took over after Sinwar was assassinated or killed in action, more accurately put, because actually they didn't know it was him.
Right.
But the bottom line is that Hamas is isolated because everything that we've just said. It has no allies that it can count on. Nobody's coming to its defense, not the Iranians, not Hezbollah. They're on their own. And if this truce in Lebanon holds, then the IDF will be able to bring more and more military forces back down south and prioritize Gaza again. And all of that is very bad news for Hamas. So my hope is that, first of all, this will influence and soften Hamas's maximalist position, which has been, until now, for Israel to leave the Gaza Strip, leave and not come back. And obviously the reason that they're making that demand, that they have been making that demand, is that they want to retake the Gaza Strip and survive and, reestablish their regime and their terror army. Now, here's what I think. I think that a hostage deal that involves a ceasefire and some minor redeployments of the IDF in the Gaza Strip is absolutely something that Israel has to consider and agree to if it's on the table. Absolutely, I'm in favor of that. What I fear is the idea of Israel leaving the Gaza Strip at a time when Hamas can bounce back and rebuild, because it's clear to me that the Iranians are patient. It's clear to me that Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood of Gaza, are patient, and they have grand schemes about rebuilding. And I don't think that after everything we've experienced, Israel can allow Hamas to retake the Gaza Strip. Many people, many soldiers have lost their lives to destroy Hamas's military capabilities and to degrade some of their regime capabilities. Unfortunately, some of those are still in place. We probably don't have time to talk about that in the form of aid, hijacking the aid. Mm-hmm. But I think that the balancing act that Israel has to make here is to, yes, offer a compromise, offer a ceasefire, offer a truce. I'm in favor of that. But what would worry me is the idea that we're going to leave Gaza under this sort of fantasy that somebody else is going to prevent Hamas from retaking Gaza. My view is that nobody at this stage can do that except Israel, except the IDF. And from a security perspective, I'm not talking about civilian. I'm not against the idea of a future Gaza and autonomy or anything like that. But from a security perspective, my view is unchanged in that it's going to be the IDF that has got to have security, freedom of movement, and control of the Gaza Strip. My model is Area A of the West Bank. It doesn't have to be there all the time. It doesn't have to be everywhere, but it has to have the ability to move in, mow the lawn, so to speak, and eliminate threats before they become monstrous once again.
And look, this is a debate that's going on as we speak, right, inside Israel, at the very top of the Israeli government. Obviously, there have been reports over the past week or two to the effect that maybe I don't want to say a new deal because it looks a lot like the old deal, but renewed talks, we'll put it that way, have been ongoing behind the scenes, and there may be more flexibility on Hamas's end. I'm very curious to see if there's more flexibility on the Netanyahu government's end. I think that's open to interpretation and remains to be seen. And I think it really will depend on those details that you mentioned, right? Mm-hmm. Is Hamas still demanding a full Israeli withdrawal? Is it demanding a full halt to the war? I think those are the types of details that are trying to be hammered out right now. And having said all that, I'm still not convinced that at least the far right in this Israeli government will be willing to agree to anything along those lines, on top of releasing potentially hundreds of Palestinian terrorists in Israeli jails. But hopefully we do find some zone of agreement between Hamas and Israel to get these talks off the ground again and to hopefully reach a deal. Remains to be seen. But really, after Lebanon, after Syria, Iran obviously has not followed through on its threats to retaliate, for Israel's last retaliation to Iran's retaliation. So I think aside from the nuclear program that you rightfully said is now a major focus, especially if Iran tries to break out, I think all of our focus here in Israel and internationally should return to where it started on October 7th, Gaza, the campaign there, definitely the hostages, and what can be done to get them home.
Yeah. By the way, in terms of the release of Palestinian terrorist security prisoners, my hunch is that that's not going to be the main stumbling block, that there will be ways to reach agreements. I think the main point of contention will remain this thing about, is the idea of being called upon to leave Gaza or not. I think that's the real sort of barrier here to deal or no deal. And the talks about who to release, my hunch is that Israel will find the way to be flexible about that, and that will not be the main stumbling block at this stage of the negotiations.
I hope so, but who knows what Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich have in mind. Again, they also have a lot to lose, right? It's not going to be so easy for them to leave the government, but remains to be seen. That would be a good problem to have if Bibi Netanyahu was actually willing to pull the trigger on some kind of deal, and the only hang up was really the number and quote unquote type of Palestinians that need to be released.
Yeah.
Yaakov, thank you so much for coming on once again and giving us our insights. And hopefully it won't be another 10 months till we have you back on. I really did think that you were on in the summer, but it wasn't. It definitely wasn't the summer. It was last February. So
incredible. We've lost all sense of time here.
Completely. Best wishes to you and the family. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks as always, Neri. Great discussion. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks again to Yaakov Lappin, as always, for his generous time and insights. Also, a special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so it can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening.